Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to the whole thing, and we're diving headfirst into our very last unit. That's right, Pierre. Our very last unit, big boy. So we are actually diving headfirst into our Unit 11, and it's going to be going over World War II and the interwar years, right? Now, to give you a little diagram of what I'm talking about, the interwar years means the period between World War I and World War II. And we're not going to be going over this in our typical, nitpicky little way. It's going to be much more thematic, much more broad-based, and much more all about answering a lot of lingering questions that some of y'all have had all year. Like, how the heck did fascist organizations like Nazis pull this whole thing off? How did they actually convince people to agree with them? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But let's get after it, right? Let's go straight into this, and we're going straight into our crash course on the Interyear Wars and World War II. So picking up right where we left off in our last unit, we're leaving off at the end of World War I. Now, the interesting thing about it is many people in the historical community refer to the interwar years as the age of anxiety, right? The age of anxiety as in from 1920 to about 1939. It's going to be about 20 years, give or take, where everyone is freaking out, right? Everyone is freaking out. You're going to have this big period in the 1920s, which is going to be economically progressive. You're going to have these really, really bad years during the 1930s, which is going to be like the Great Depression and all this other stuff, and we'll get into all of that stuff right now, right? So jumping into it, first and foremost, the interwar years. Or for some, what we mean by that is post-World War I was very new and very intense. Intense is just along the lines that for some people the interwar years was really, really good. Speaking mostly about the 1920s. From 1929 to about 1939 it was pretty much bad for the entire Western world. But for some, post-World War I was referred to commonly as the Roaring Twenties, right? As we already know, World War I is going to end in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles. It is going to horrifically blame Germany for World War I and cascade us into a situation where we're basically going to be inching towards another war. But the Roaring Twenties is what it was referred to for the winners of World War I, right? The United States of America, Great Britain, France, and all those guys referred to this rise of a consumer economy in the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties, right? The era of dancing and flappers and modern appliances and cheap fashions and personal care products and things like that, right? You're seeing the growth of a new type of consumer economy. You're seeing the growth of a type of consumer economy where people can go out and buy refrigerators and stoves, and the drugstore becomes a really big thing in the sense of your Walgreens and your CVS is all beginning in the 1920s. You can go buy simple things like your night creams and things like that at a very easy little counter and take care of it, and a man in a white coat will serve it to you. It'll be awesome, right? Travel and leisure is also popping off. The auto industry. You've got people like Henry Ford making ideas and making new cars like this bad boy right here, the Model T, right? So the Model T becomes the very first well-made, highly manufactured vehicle in the Western historical, or in the Western economy, right? Travel and auto for leisure is going to become an industry. Electricity is now going to almost basically every single city. Not in the countryside and stuff like that. Most people in the countryside in the 1920s were still using lamps and kerosene and stuff like that. But almost every city had electrified wires going through it, had access to things like, for example, electric lights. As of 1893, at this big thing called the World's Fair, they're going to showcase Thomas Edison's incandescent light bulb, and people are going to now have electric current that can go to their homes, right? Now, the countrysides are a little bit of a different story, but we're not getting into that. The telephone is now becoming a modern sight inside of people's homes, and you're even seeing gas stations, right? You're seeing gas stations modeled off of things from World War I and things like that, and a lot of money is being made. That's why we got that cash money symbol right there. So much money being made during the 1920s. PB, come here, bud. So in the long run about it, though, you also have the growing image of this new woman, right? So the 1920s is bringing along this image of the new woman, Pierre. The new woman is going to be this one where it's the stereotypical image of the modern independent working woman of the 1920s, right? As of 1919 in the United States of America, that woman could vote, right? That woman could work. She had her own job. She spent her own money. And Pierre, she even smoked cigarettes. in public, right? Like, so, like, yes, that's a really, really big thing that you need to understand, is that the new image of this new woman with shorter hair, wore shorter dresses, went out, did her own thing, didn't necessarily need the dependence or reliance on the man, right? Like, so you have her kind of, like, see the growth of this new independent image of a woman that's going to be adopted in the 1920s, because we are seeing women's rights come forward. We are seeing the growth of suffrage movements both in the United States of America and abroad as well. Actually, women were allowed to vote in Great Britain as early as 1918, 1917, about a year and a half before American women were allowed to vote. Crazy thing about it, though, France, they didn't let women vote until 1941, which is wild, right? So, like, you're seeing the growth of this new roaring 20s where people are driving their cars and women are smoking their cigarettes and they're doing all this crazy stuff and they're going to jazz clubs and they're dancing in this goofy, like, little, like, thing like this. I'm going to throw it up on the screen right here. That dance right there is called the Charleston, right? Yeah, people going to jazz clubs and the emergence of modern music and all these other things. And speaking of modern things, you even had the growth of the cinema. The cinema! You could go to the movies! Like, you could actually go to the movies after World War I. You saw the growth of this entire new genre of film, right? And this right here are two very, very famous films that popped up during the 1920s. That right there is, this one up top is Nosferatu, one of the most chilling, intense, silent movies. Most of the films from the 1920s were silent still. And then also, like, Nosferatu is one of the first horror films that came out. It's actually about Dracula and stuff like that, as you can see with his long fingers and his fangs and whatnot. And then this guy becomes really, really popular. That right there is Charlie Chaplin, right? Charlie Chaplin, who is also known as the Tramp, who does a lot of comedy movies and stuff. But you didn't really have a television at your house. Most people had a radio, right? So radio programs were coming on, and the roaring 20s just kept roaring forward. And, like, for example, you got kids right here listen to what's known as a ham radio, and they're listening probably to a radio program. A lot of families would hang out around the radio in the 1920s and listen to things like Dick Tracy or comic book shows or like film detective noir series that would come on at night, much like a television show comes on now, and much like Pierre is licking the ever-loving daylights out of me. Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is the art scene is also going to dramatically change, right? The art scene is going to dramatically change in a big way to kind of represent how broken society was after World War I, right? The art scene is going to change and move towards really, really intense forms of art. You're seeing the birth of modern art, non-representational art, and much more intense concepts. That kind of just demonstrates how far we've come since, like, the Renaissance era, right? World War I killed millions of people. Millions of people. 10 million soldiers, and we believe 10 million civilians. And so art is kind of a really interesting way to represent the emotions of Europe and Western civilizations during this time period. For example, one of the big art trends that comes around while the radio's getting big, while the cinema's getting big, and while people are going and buying new things at drugstores, Pierre, all these new things start coming around, but Dadaism becomes a big trend in art following World War I. Now, the funniest thing about it is Dadaism was a really, really intense form of art. A form of art where basically anything could be art. And it just demonstrates, like, the brokenness of society following World War I. Like, that right there is one of the most famous post-World War I Dada pieces. It's just an upside-down urinal, right? Like, that right there is literally an upside-down urinal, and that is considered one of the most infamous pieces of Dada art. You could do anything with it. You could literally have, like, a broken chair and be like, I call it boots. Like, so, and they would be like, oh my god. So, like, art became very, very extreme, very non-representational. Why do I keep zooming in on this, like, urinal? That right there is Dada art as well, and I even have a poster in my classroom about Dadaism, too. Speaking of posters, you also saw the birth of stuff like surrealism, right? Salvador Dali and his art is going to become very, very famous following World War I because it begins to represent things in a dreamlike scape, right? In a dreamlike space that only can exist in one's mind. This one right here is called The Persistence of Memory. Almost everyone knows that piece of art. But as you can see, art's getting really, really intense. It's leaving, like, some of the old, like use of color. It's going dark and very intense imagery. And it really represents the craziness that World War I put onto the earth. This right here is the one that I have hanging in my classroom up front. This thing is called Geopoliticus and Child. And this is going to be how I know that you're paying attention to this flip. C period, talking to y'all, right? That right there is a man emerging from the United States of America on the map. The map of the globe, of course, is an egg because egg was supposed to represent birth and things like that. And these two figures right here are pointing to a destroyed Europe, right? And a marbled up piece of Africa. And basically this entire region of the world was destroyed by World War I. But after World War I ended, America was now emerging. So this man right here is supposed to be the United States of America, emerging out of the egg as the new world superpower, right? Because we entered into the war and kind of basically pushed the world fronts back and really, really won that war in a big way. So as you can tell, the Roaring Twenties, they're pretty intense, right? Now this is a subtle warning that you will not understand this at all if I'm muted. Very subtle, just want to let you know. But what is this thing that's like, how is this all happening? Like, how is all this happening? Why is the Roaring Twenties happening now? World War I and the winning of World War I for the Allies can't be the big reason why all of this stuff is going down. Well, a big reason behind the whole thing is due to the fact that technology is making factories much more efficient, PP boy. Now, this is PP boy because he, like, literally just pees all over my house. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it, though, is technology is making factories much more efficient. The economy of many nations, not Germany, exploded during the 1920s because of the advancement of technology and the advancement of production, right? You're seeing the growth and birth of new models of production. New items are flying out of factories at an aggressive rate, never like they have ever before. And that's exploding during the 1920s, mostly because of these new things of like tech. For example, speaking of Henry Ford, that right there is how he produced that car and that vehicle, that Model T, that became such a big deal. That right there is an assembly line. So the way the assembly line would work is they were able to make products in a much more efficient and much more strategic way, because literally the assembly line, the item would move down a line very, very slowly, and every single person along that line would have a certain job. As you can see right here, these men are installing the steering column and I believe the gas tank onto this Model T, and it makes it so the products are much cheaper, but it also makes it so they're much more efficiently made, so you can make more of them, and if supply is up, that means demand is low. Well, not demand is necessarily low, but demand was so high, and they were charging such a cheap price for everything that everyone could now afford a vehicle, which is crazy, and I seem to have called a Pierre here. Now, the big thing about it, though, is the assembly line production is a very, very intense model of production, and also the 5-day work week. That's right, the 1920s is going to see the adoption of your Monday through Friday, 40 hours a week, and then you're going to have your 5-day work week where you work every single day in a factory from Monday through Friday, and you make your money, and you make your little bit of, like, you know, your little money on the side, and you can go out and spend it, right? So you can go spend it at the movies. You can buy your radio with it. You can go to the drugstore and get those personal care products. Or like for all y'all, you can go get your nails done and stuff like that during this time period because you were able to work 5 days a week and go out and make that money. Now, that is why a big reason why all this stuff is exploded. And another big thing as well is leisure time. That's right, your weekends. Now you could go out and do stuff. You could go dance like these people down here in the bottom right corner. You could go to the beach like these young people right here who are go back. You could go to the beach like these young people right here who are like actually enjoying a weekend out and stuff like that. Or you could do like these gentlemen are and be in a sports league, right? You had leisure time. Your Saturdays and Sundays were now spent spending that money that you made on the outside, going out and participating in those Roaring Twenties, going out and dancing the Charleston, hanging out, buying you cigarettes and doing all that stuff, right? But the thing about it that you need to understand that's a very, very important construct is that the Roaring Twenties is not really roaring for everyone, right? It's not really roaring for everybody. It's basically only roaring for, like, middle and upper class citizens of winning countries and mostly people that are of, like, European descent or what you would ethnically consider white in many countries, right? Because you have to understand that there's some massive lingering issues going on after World War I. You have a huge amount of anti-Semitism. Now, the big thing I need you to do is write down what anti-Semitism means next to the word anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is like the organized prejudice against Jewish people, which had been going on in Europe since the late 1870s. Right now at an extreme rate, as in violence and very extreme tendencies, pogroms in Russia and very, very other extreme things, and also the birth of the Zionism movement, right? Now, you also have in places like the United States of America and in Europe as well, huge amounts of lingering racism, right? Racism coming from, of course, imperial colonies, coming from places in like the United States of America and things like that, and very, very aggressive racist crimes, including things like violence against minorities and things like lynchings that became very, very intense things going on in the United States of America during the 1920s. And you also saw eugenics. Now, eugenics is another really, really creepy science that popped up during the 1920s, and it demonstrates how basically the 1920s was really only roaring if you were making money and you were the dominant racial group in the country that you were in, right? So, for example, in the United States of America and the South, you had lynchings and you also had events like this going on, known as the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? Let me, fix that real quick. There we go. The Tulsa Race Riot that went on was actually going down in Oklahoma, right? So, like this image right here, which is like a picture from the Tulsa race massacre that actually occurred in the summer of 1918 or 19, I believe, where the entire middle-class black neighborhood of Greenwood, Oklahoma, was completely destroyed because of the wrongful accusation of a man who was walking out of an elevator. And we'll talk about that more in class and stuff like that. But this all was also adopted on the heels of a process called eugenics. Eugenics was a really, really screwed up pseudoscience that popped up during the 1920s, okay? Pseudoscience means fake science. The word pseudo, P-S-E-U-D-O, is Latin for false, right? That's why clams are called pseudopods, because it means false foot, because they have this tongue that they go blah, and they stick out and they move around and stuff. But pseudoscience means a fake science. It's not backed up by real science. And eugenics was aimed at creating genetically superior races by excluding people who they judged to be inferior, right? For example, eugenics is going to lead to mass sterilizations in states like California. It's going to lead to mass sterilizations and also the prejudice against people of different sexualities in places like England, right? So going into that as well, where it became literally illegal to be of a different sexuality in England. Oscar Wilde was a very famous author that was literally chemically sterilized and then also put in jail for his lifestyle, right? So the thing about it is eugenics is super creepy, and I need you to do me a favor. I need you to highlight it. We're going to talk a lot about it when we actually get back in class, because it's actually going to lead directly to the Holocaust, and it's also going to lead directly to the adoption of aggressive anti-Semitism activities of the Nazi Party in Germany during the 1930s, right? Now, the ideas grew in the 1920s, right? Served as justification for mass sterilization campaigns, later the Holocaust and the exclusion of Jewish populations of Europe, and then also it was used as evidence to support racist activity. But again, let's linger on that word right there, pseudoscience. It wasn't real. People were trying to use it as a way to justify their disgusting activity, right? Their disgusting racism and their disgusting violence against minority communities. Eugenics is a very big deal, and it's this disgusting thing that's happening in the background of the Roaring Twenties, right? While people are going out and dancing and buying all these new things and having these new automobiles and buying their Model T Ford and having their brand new refrigerator delivered to their house. At the exact same time, there was extreme violence against minority communities throughout many countries in Western civilizations, including Europe and the United States, right? So the big thing about it, though, is we're going to skip over this thing right here because we just don't have that kind of time this year to talk about a lot of imperial things, but it's okay because we need to focus on the true casualties of World War I. Again, we've been talking about the Roaring Twenties this whole time, this period of great expansion and economic growth, right? But what about the men from World War I? What about them? What about what happened to... Give me that. Sorry, I got digging around in the trash. Quit it. So, what about the men from World War I who were injured, the veterans? What about them? Were they a part of the Roaring Twenties? Well, the thing about it is no. Not really, right? 23 million injured veterans were actually injured during World War I, and you're going to see the biggest growth of a very, very, very decimated population in many European cities and communities, right? For example, you're not only going to see physical ailments, like, for example, this young man right here who was attacked by mustard gas and went blind in one of his eyes. You're not going to only see physical ailments like these men who are now on crutches, who have lost legs to artillery explosions. You are also going to see men demonstrate the very first cases of PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. The World War I actually was the very first war to bring evidence to mental incapabilities of soldiers after massive wars, and also after a war that was such a bad stalemate that led to the death and destruction of so many lives, right? And they didn't know what PTSD was after World War I, so they actually referred to it as shell shock, right? Because a lot of times men, like veterans coming home, would be triggered by loud noises because it reminded them of artillery shells in World War I, and it would lead to manic episodes, right? And so you're seeing this entire subgroup of people that is getting left behind during the Roaring Twenties, quote unquote, and they're all the veterans of this war, right? And a very cool person that I like to talk about a lot is this woman by the name of Anna Coleman Ladd, who actually is a very intense figure who demonstrates her direct activism and her direct involvement in trying to heal the lives of some of these veterans. She's a very important woman to me in Western civilization's history that you know who she is, but who she was is she basically worked with veterans to make them prosthetics for their faces if they had been injured during World War I, so they could actually exist in regular society. Because the man that's wearing that mask right there is actually pictured right here. He was completely burned and disfigured from an artillery blast that completely destroyed his jaw, his nose, and the entire lower half of his face. So how do you send a man like this back into regular society? Well, Anna Coleman Ladd and her work made a prosthetic mask that he could wear in society so he could try his best to participate with everyone else, right? So this is a great representation, and her work is a huge representation of the destroyed lives of so many of these veterans, because many of them are going to attempt to re-enter this post-industrial economy. They're going to want to get jobs in factories. They're going to want to have jobs on that assembly line. They're going to want to participate in the 1920s, roaring 20s as well. But the issue is that they're being left behind, right? They attempt to re-enter, but many couldn't, and all the while, women are going to be replacing them. Because during World War I, women entered into the factories and became producers and workers in factories to help produce war goods during that total war of attrition of World War I. And so the thing about it is these factory owners realize that these women can do these jobs and they don't have to pay them as much. So many of these men went off, fought, and lost parts of their body or lost their mind for their countries, and then they returned home to a country that wouldn't even give them work, right? So the economy boomed without them, which is a very terrifying aspect of a war's true casualties, right? So now the big thing about it, though, is those booming economies are really only valid if you're one of the big three, right? Like, so now, like, the 1920s was really only going down as the roaring 20s for, like, the United States of America, Great Britain, France, places that won World War I. If you're in Russia, not having a good time because you just had a communist revolution and you're in the middle of a civil war. If you're in Germany, not having a good time because you have to understand they're having an awful experience because they have to pay back $2.7 trillion after the Treaty of Versailles. Listen to me very carefully. Jot this down, right? The Treaty of Versailles is going to lead directly to World War II. Say it with me now. The Treaty of Versailles is going to lead directly to World War II. I'm going to ask you, what led directly to World War II? And you're going to say, the Treaty of Versailles. And you're going to say, Mr. Terry, how much did the Treaty of Versailles lead to World War II? And I'm going to be like, oh, it led directly to World War II because it blamed Germany for the war, chopped up most of Central Europe, and didn't give them an economy to balance themselves back out again. Because if you're one of the losers, the worst being Italy and Germany during this time period, you are having massive problems in these areas, right? First and foremost, you've got hyperinflation occurring, right? The German government didn't have money to pay back this $2.7 trillion. And within a year, they started defaulting on those payments, not having enough money to pay back the big three, not having enough money to actually meet the Treaty of Versailles, not having enough money to actually try and pay off these war debts. And so what's happening is, this is why you can't just print money. A lot of kids have always asked me, why can't you just print money, Mr. Terry? Because what happens is that money loses value if there's more of it in circulation in the economy. And what ends up going down is you end up with situations like this. That is a German man who's going off to pay for a loaf of bread. This is how much of their money it took to pay for that loaf of bread. Deutschmarks became so worthless that kids would play with them in the streets like they were building blocks. Those are children playing with stacks of cash. That is hyperinflation. In Germany, some people burned their Deutschmarks as fuel to keep their homes warm because it was so worthless, right? That's children playing with stacks of money because it's not worth anything. And that's going on in Germany. This is leading also to higher unemployment, failing businesses. And a very key thing that I think you should highlight right there, fractured masculinity, right? In turn, you are creating a group of men that fought in this war, might have been injured veterans, have no jobs, they're unemployed, and the money that their country is producing doesn't even do anything for them. So it's actually turning into this issue where men are looking for someone to blame. They're angry, they want someone to blame, and all it's going to take is guys like these dudes to show up and give them someone to be mad at, right? So these right here, we're going to now talk about the rise of the totalitarian dictators, right? So totalitarianism is one of my favorite words in the entirety of what I teach in a year, right? Say it with me again. Totalitarianism, right? Totalitarianism, 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 right? So we're going to see the rise of totalitarianism during the late 1920s, going into the 1930s, for a lot of these larger countries in Europe as well as in other areas going forward. So some of you are probably asking yourself, you're like, all right, Mr. Terry, I get it. You think that the word totalitarianism is pretty important and you think it's pretty intense, right? Well, let's chat about what that actually means for a hot second, right? So the thing about it is totalitarianism is defined by a government that seeks total control over the lives of their citizens through the use of a centralized dictatorship, right? And I mean total control. They tell you what you can do, when you can do it, where you can do it, who you can do it with, and how you're going to do it, right? Totalitarians come in and they take over these countries and begin to exert their control and authority over anyone that they see fit, which is basically everybody, right? And you end up with two different types of totalitarian dictators during the late 1920s and going into the 1930s, right? So you have the first one, which are known as fascist totalitarian dictators or fascist dictators. Now, some of you need to understand, you might have heard this from somebody that you know before, that actually, oh, some people like the Nazis were actually socialists. They're not. They hid behind the label of socialism to try and pander to a lot of these veterans and poorer figures to try and be like, we want to help you do this, we want to do that, but they actually weren't socialist. They were a word that didn't have a description yet. They were actually known as fascist, right? Now, really, really quickly, where does that whole idea of fascism come from? The big thing about it is you have to understand that this word, fascism, actually comes all the way back from ancient Rome. Do y'all not remember when we actually talked about this thing or this concept known as fascism or fasces, right? That right there, that's right. For my people that remember Rome so well, that's a fascist, right? The fascist was that thing in Rome that demonstrated the strength of the state, right? The wooden rods around the axe, right? The thing you need to understand is that the ideas in World War II are coming full circle, right? We're going all the way back to Rome for a hot second, right? So the word fascism actually was born in Rome, right? Because this guy was trying to use that word to his own kind of idea, right? So the word fascism comes from the fasces of ancient Rome, the strength of the state with the people centered around it, right? What fascism is, though, it's a far-right, ultra-nationalist idea characterized by forcible suppression of opposition. Now, a lot of y'all are like, Mr. Terry, I don't know what that means. Here's what fascism is. It's the idea that the country comes before the person, that the country comes before the state, or that the country comes before the people that live in it, right? It's not about you. It's about the glorification of Italy or Germany or whatever, right? To make this thing so awesome, right? Like, so, la, 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 la. That's fascism, right? Hitler didn't care about the individual German. He cared about the glory of Germany. Much like this guy right here, who is going to be the premier fascist dictator. That right there is the Italian one, Benito Mussolini, who actually invented the concept of fascism and actually came up with the entire word and created what is known as the Italian Fascist Party. And this was their emblem, a golden eagle standing on top of a fascist, right? And we know of another fascist dictator by the name of Adolf Hitler, okay? So do me a favor really quick. In the late 1920s, while everyone else is roaring, you're going to see the rise of these fascist organizations, right? Ones like, for example, Benito Mussolini in Italy, right? Mussolini is spelled Musssolini, right? So, and he's from Italy. He's going to actually come to power in 1929 when he leads a group of these people known as the Black Shirts through Italy. And we'll talk about those guys a little bit more in class, right? And then you're going to see Adolf Hitler come to power with the Nazi organization. I'm covering that image up right now because I don't like it. It creeps me out and I hate it with a fiery passion, right? But Adolf Hitler is somebody that you know very well. He is going to create the Nazi organization or the Nationalist Socialist Movement, which is not actually socialism at all. They're fascism. And he's going to actually come to power in 1933 completely, but he starts his entire campaign in 1925, right? So the thing about it is while the rest of the world is roaring, these guys in these countries are being taken over by these totalitarian dictators, right? And so you have that entire thing. You've got the fascists coming up in Italy and in like Germany, and Hitler is actually going to be rising to power in Germany. You also have your communist totalitarian dictator, right? Your communist totalitarian dictator is going to be a man by the name of Joseph Stalin, right? So now look, so you have your fascist dictators, and then you have your communist dictator. right? So both of these two types are totalitarian. But the thing about it is that Joseph Stalin was never really a communist in the first place, right? But you need to get comfortable with that name, Joseph Stalin, because he rises to power in Russia during the 1920s. He actually takes power completely in 1924. So what we're seeing is the rise of fascist totalitarians and communist totalitarians in Europe during the 1920s. While everybody else is having a great time, while the winners of World War I are having the roaring 20s, you're seeing the growth of really aggressive dictatorships with military backings in many of the countries that were left hanging after World War I. And that's where we're going to stop, and we're going to pick up on all this stuff when we get back into class whenever I see you again. And I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.